Imagine you are standing in a world that is very, very cold. This is 30,000 years ago. There are no heaters to turn on. There are no grocery stores to visit. There are no walls to protect you from the wind. Above you, the sky is a deep, dark purple, and the stars look like bright diamonds. In the distance, you can see giant ribbons of green light dancing in the air. We call this the Ice Age, a time when the earth was covered in white for thousands of years. To the people living then, the cave people, this cold world was their only home. But to live here, they had to be the smartest creatures on earth. They weren't monsters or brutes. They were master thinkers. They were the world's first engineers and the world's first planners. They knew that to stay alive, they had to understand every secret of the frozen land. To understand how they lived, we first have to look at the animal that ruled the snow. This was the woolly mammoth. Imagine a creature that is taller than your house. It is covered in thick, shaggy brown hair that hangs down to its feet. This hair is like a giant, heavy blanket. Under that hair is a layer of soft wool, and under that wool is a thick layer of fat. This fat is like a battery. It stores all the energy the mammoth needs to survive the long, dark winter when there is no fresh grass to eat. The mammoth has two giant curved teeth called tusks. They aren't straight like ours. They curve up and around like giant hooks made of ivory. The mammoth uses these tusks like snow shovels. It moves its head from side to side to push the deep snow away so it can reach the dry grass buried underneath. It is a 4-ton mountain of muscle. To a single human, the mammoth looks like a god. It is too big to fight. It is too strong to stop. But to a group of humans, a tribe, the mammoth is a walking warehouse. If the tribe can catch just one mammoth, they will have everything they need to survive. One mammoth provides enough meat to fill the bellies of 50 people for a month. Its thick skin can be turned into a waterproof tent. Its fat can be burned in small stone lamps to give light in the dark. Its bones can be used as the beams for a house. Its stomach can even be cleaned and used as a bag to carry water. But the mammoth is smart. It lives in a family herd, led by an old, wise grandmother mammoth. She remembers every path and every water hole. If the humans want to catch a mammoth, they cannot use their muscles. They have to use their minds. A mammoth has very small eyes and cannot see very well. But it has a nose that is the best in the world. Its trunk is like a super sensor. It can smell a human from 2 miles away. If the wind is blowing from the humans toward the mammoth will smell them and run away, or worse, it will charge and crush them. The hunters knew this. They understood the secret of the wind. They learned how to read the air. Before they started to hunt, they would pick up a handful of dry snow or dust and let it fall. They watched which way it blew. They would only move if the wind was blowing from the mammoth toward them. This way, their human smell was carried away into the empty snow, and the mammoth had no idea they were there. They also learned the trick of chemical camouflage. They would rub their bodies with things that smelled like the forest. They used pine needles, wood ash, or even the frozen poop of the mammoths. They didn't want to smell like people. They wanted to smell like the earth. They moved in total silence, using hand signals to talk to each other. They were like ghosts in the snow, moving slowly, step by step, staying downwind and out of sight. While they moved, they were also looking at the shape of the land. A human weighs about 150 pounds. A mammoth weighs 12,000 pounds. If you try to push a mammoth, you will fail. But if you let the earth do the work, you can win. The hunters were the world's first landscape artists. They didn't just walk around looking for luck. They looked for the perfect spot to set a trap. They looked for natural funnels. Imagine a narrow path with high stone walls on both sides where a mammoth cannot turn around. Or imagine a steep cliff with a sharp drop-off. But the most famous trap was the mud bog. In the summer, the very top of the frozen ground melts a little bit. It turns into a thick, sticky mud, but just a few inches below that mud. The ground is still frozen solid like iron. A mammoth is very heavy. If it steps into that mud, its giant feet will sink deep, and the sticky clay will hold it like a vice. Because it is so heavy, the mammoth cannot pull its legs out. It gets stuck. The hunt was a giant game of steering. The tribe worked together like a single team. The drivers were the young, fast people. They didn't carry spears. They carried fire and drums. They would find a mammoth that was a little bit away from the herd. Then they would jump out and make a huge noise. They would scream, hit their drums, and wave their flaming torches. The mammoth would get scared and run. But it wasn't running just anywhere. It was being steered. By making noise on one side, the humans forced the mammoth to run toward the mud bog or the narrow canyon. The mammoth thought it was escaping, but it was actually running right into the trap. Once the mammoth's legs were stuck in the mud, its power was gone. It was no longer a moving mountain. It was a target. Now, the hunters could move in safely to finish the job. While the mud trap held the mammoth, the hunters needed a way to pierce through its thick skin and layers of fat. This is where their engineering skills come in. They didn't just use sharp sticks. They built a weapon system. It started with the stone heart. The tip of the spear was made of a special rock called flint. Flint is very hard, but if you hit it the right way, it breaks like glass. The tool maker of the tribe was a scientist. He would take a heavy rock and hit the flint to knock off big pieces. Then he would use a piece of deer antler to press against the edges, peeling off tiny, tiny flakes. This process created an edge that was sharper than any kitchen knife you have today. It was sharper than a doctor's scalpel, but the flint was also very fragile. If it hit a bone, it might snap. To fix this, they carved a long, shallow groove into the bottom of the stone point. This groove let the stone sit perfectly against the wooden stick, so the force of the hit was spread out. This kept the stone from breaking, but how did they stick the stone to the wood? They didn't have tape or super glue, so they invented their own. They discovered the secret of birch tar. They would take the bark of a birch tree and put it in a hole in the ground. They covered the hole with clay so no air could get in, and then they built a fire on top. Without air, the bark didn't turn to ash. Instead, it cooked and turned into a thick, black, sticky liquid. This was the world's first glue. It was waterproof and stronger than modern glue. They would heat the black tar until it was soft, put it on the spear, and then wrap it with sinew. Sinew is the string-like stuff found in an animal's leg. It is very strong. When it is wet, it is stretchy. But when it dries, it shrinks and gets very tight. By wrapping the wet sinew around the spearhead and the glue, it would dry and pull everything together until the stone and the wood were like one single piece. Even with a perfect spear, a human cannot throw it very far or very hard. Our arms are just too short. The hunters solved this with a brilliant invention called the atlatl, or the spear thrower. Imagine a wooden handle about 2 feet long with a small hook at the end. The hunter would fit the back of his spear onto that hook and hold the handle in his hand. When he threw the spear, the handle acted like an extra long arm. Think about a playground swing. If the chain is short, the swing is slow. If the chain is long, the swing goes much faster. The spear thrower made the human arm much longer in a mechanical way. It gave the hunter more power. A spear thrown by hand is slow, but a spear thrown with an atlatl can travel at 90 miles per hour. It could fly through the air and hit a mammoth with enough force to go through 4 inches of fat and reach the heart. The atlatl turned the human hunter into a long-distance sniper. They didn't have to get close to the dangerous tusks. They could stay 50 yards away, safely out of reach, and throw their spears with incredible power and accuracy. Hunting a giant mammoth was a big event, but it didn't happen every day. Mammoths were hard to find and dangerous to kill. To eat every day, the tribe relied on a different kind of hunting, the silent hunt. This was the world of traps and snares. This type of hunting required a different kind of smarts. It required thinking like the animal. The hunter had to ask himself, if I am a hungry rabbit, where would I hide from the wind? Which path would I take to find a tiny bit of green grass under the snow? The hunters would find game trails. These are the tiny paths in the snow that animals use over and over again. Once they found a trail, they would set a trap. The first trap used the power of gravity. It was called a deadfall. The hunter would find a very heavy flat stone and prop it up with 3 small sticks. These sticks were balanced so perfectly that if an animal touched them, they would collapse. The hunter would put a little bit of food, like a dried berry or a piece of root, under the stone. When a fox or a squirrel tried to take the food, the sticks would fall and the heavy stone would drop instantly. It was a silent way to hunt that worked. While the hunter was back at the camp, sleeping by the fire, the second trap used the power of tension. It was called a snare. This was a masterpiece of simple physics. The hunter would find a young, flexible tree and bend it down toward the ground. He would tie it with a string made of animal gut and use a small bone trigger to hold it in place. Then he would make a loop with the string and place it over the trail. When a rabbit hopped through the loop, its foot would pull the string. This would trip the trigger, and the bent tree would snap back up into the air with a loud whoosh. The tree would lift the rabbit off the ground, keeping it away from other predators like wolves. For animals that were bigger than a rabbit but smaller than a mammoth, like the Ice Age, reindeer, the tribe used a pitfall trap. This was a huge project that required the whole tribe to work together. They would choose a path where the reindeer herds traveled every year during the spring. Then they would dig a giant hole in the ground. Because the ground was frozen, they had to use fire to melt the dirt and then scrape it out with bone shovels. They would dig the hole 6 feet deep. At the bottom, They would place sharpened stakes made of mammoth bone, pointing up. Then they would cover the top of the hole with thin branches and a fresh layer of soft snow. To the reindeer, it looked like solid ground. To make sure the reindeer ran into the hole, the humans built rock piles that looked like people from a distance. The reindeer would see these rock people and get scared, turning away and running directly onto the hidden trap. The earth would vanish under their feet, and the hunt would be over. To us, a field of snow looks like a blank sheet of paper. But to an Ice Age hunter, that snow was like a book filled with stories. They practiced the art of sign reading. The trackers were the world's first data analysts. They could look at a single footprint and tell you exactly what had happened. If the edges of the track were sharp and crisp, it meant the animal had just passed by. If the edges were soft and rounded, it meant the track was old and the animal was far away. They could look at how deep the track was to tell if the animal was heavy or thin. They even looked for hair left behind on trees. If the hair was healthy, the animal was strong. If the hair was brittle and dry, the animal might be sick and easier to catch. They also watched the birds. They knew that ravens were the scouts of the tundra. If a group of ravens was circling a specific spot, it meant there was a dead animal there, or a predator, like a saber-toothed tiger, was hiding in the brush. When the mammoth finally fell and the hunt was over, the work was only half finished. A 6-ton animal is a lot of work. If they didn't move fast, the meat would freeze into a rock, or a pack of hungry wolves would arrive. This was a choreographed dance. Every person had a job. The men with the sharpest flint knives would remove the giant skin. The women were the experts in anatomy. They knew exactly where the joints were. They would cut the mammoth into large slabs of meat. But they didn't just take the muscle. They knew that the most important parts were the internal treasures. They took the heart, the liver, and the kidneys. These parts are full of vitamins that you cannot find in the frozen grass. They even took the brain. They didn't eat it. They used it to tan the hide. The chemicals in the brain help make the leather soft and waterproof. They took the stomach and cleaned it out to use as a bucket. They took the marrow from inside the bones. This is the most calorie-rich food on the planet. For a child in the Ice Age, a piece of bone marrow was better than any candy bar. This was zero-waste survival. They respected the mammoth. They believed that because the animal had given its life, they had a duty to use every single ounce of it. They would even save the tiny whiskers to use as needles. When they were finished, only a clean skeleton was left. They would often place the mammoth's skull facing the sunrise as a way to say thank you to the spirit of the giant. We cannot talk about the hunt without talking about what the hunters wore. In the Ice Age, your clothes were your spacesuit. If your clothes failed, you died in minutes. The first tailors were the women of the tribe. They were experts in thermal engineering. They invented the parka. This was a coat with a hood made of 2 layers of fur. The first layer had the fur facing inward toward the skin to trap warm air. The second layer had the fur facing outward to shed the snow. For the hood, they always used wolverine fur because it is the only hair that does not get frosty from a human's breath. They made boots out of reindeer skin and filled them with dried grass. This grass acted like a sponge, soaking up sweat, Every night, they would put in fresh, dry grass. This kept their feet warm enough to stay still in the snow for hours. The final and most important secret of the hunt wasn't a spear or a trap. It was the mindset of the tribe. Living in the Ice Age was like living on another planet. It was a world of infinite white. To survive, they had to be mentally tough. They developed a pack intelligence. They didn't think about me. They thought about us. If one person was cold, the whole tribe worked to warm them. They used stories as manuals. Every night, by the fire, the elders would tell stories about the great hunts of the past. These weren't just for fun. They were audio lessons. A story about a hunter who got lost in a storm taught the children how to find their way back home. By listening, the children learned 20,000 years of survival wisdom before they were even old enough to hold a spear. They also mastered their emotions. When a 6-ton mammoth is charging at you, you want to panic. But the hunters used rhythmic breathing and low, humming chants to keep their hearts calm. They learned how to turn off their fear and focus on the plan. As the sun sets over the valley, the tribe gathers around a fire made of dry scrub and mammoth dung. The smell of roasting meat fills the air. The spears are being cleaned, and the stone points are being sharpened for tomorrow. The children are sleeping on beds of soft fur, their bellies full, their bodies warm. The Primal Hunt was our first great victory. It was the moment we proved that we were the masters of our own destiny. We didn't have claws and we didn't have tusks, but we had an idea. We learned to take a rock and a stick and turn them into a tool that could change the world. Every piece of technology you have today, the car you drive, the house you live in, the phone you are using, is a direct descendant of that flint point and that spear thrower. The hunt survived the coldest winters in history, and it survived the end of the mammoths themselves. It survived because we were flexible. We learned to adapt. We learned to cooperate. And most importantly, we learned to never give up. So, the next time you feel a cold wind on your face, or the next time you use a tool to solve a problem, take a moment to remember the shadows on the snow. Remember the spear thrower and the mud trap. You are a descendant of the greatest survivors the world has ever seen. We didn't just survive the Ice Age, we conquered it, one stone, one plan, and one mammoth at a time. The wind across the world 30,000 years ago was a sound that never truly stopped. It was not a gentle breeze that would rustle the leaves of a summer tree, but a constant, heavy roar that had traveled across thousands of miles of flat, solid blue ice. This wind carried the weight of the great white death. In the middle of the Ice Age winter, the sun was no longer a warm friend. It was a pale, cold circle in the sky that disappeared early in the afternoon, leaving the world in a deep, purple shadow for 18 hours a day. The grass, which had been green and gold during the short, frantic summer, was now buried under many feet of snow that had been packed by the wind until it was as hard as stone. The great rivers were silent, locked away under ice so thick that a group of mammoths could walk across them without making a single sound. The giant herds of reindeer, bison, and horses had moved far away, searching for tiny pockets of warmth at the very edge of the world. What was left behind was a landscape that was beautiful, white, and completely empty. Every step a human took in this snow made a loud, sharp, crunching sound that could be heard for miles because the world was so quiet. The air was so dry and so cold that it would sting the back of your throat when you took a deep breath. This was a world where a single mistake or a single day of laziness could lead to the end of a family. To the people living then, the winter was not just a season that lasted a few months. It was a giant, hungry beast that followed them every day of their lives. It was an era where time was measured not by weeks or months, but by the level of food left in the storage bags and the strength remaining in the bodies of the tribe. This is the second part of our journey into the lives of the first survivors, the people who lived during the longest winter in human history. We are moving away from the exciting stories of the hunt and the spears to look at a much bigger and much quieter challenge. This was the challenge of time. In the Ice Age, catching an animal was only the very beginning of the battle. The real test of a person's smarts was figuring out how to make the meat from a single animal last for 3 or 4 months. They had to figure out how to stop the meat from rotting. They had to figure out how to hide their food from the hungry monsters that prowled the night. They had to learn how to live when there was absolutely nothing left to find in the frozen forest. This is the story of the Great Hunger and how our ancestors turned the freezing world itself into their own giant pantry. It is a story about patience, about memory, and about the clever ways humans used the cold to beat the cold. It is a story about how we learned to look at a field of snow and see a way to survive. The people of the Ice Age had to be more than just hunters. They had to be the first thinkers of the home. They had to understand the secrets of the ice, the wind, and the fire to keep the tiny things that spoil food away from their families. To understand how they survived these months of empty bellies, we first have to think about what happens to the human body when it is very cold and very hungry. When you are cold, your body is like a small fire that needs more and more wood to keep burning. You burn energy just to stay warm. Your heart has to pump harder to keep your blood moving through your fingers and toes. And your muscles have to work harder just to keep you standing against the wind. This meant that the people of the Ice Age needed to eat much more than we do today. They needed fat and protein just to survive the sub-zero temperatures. But the problem was that meat starts to change as soon as the animal dies. To the people of the tribe, the biggest enemy wasn't the big cat with the long teeth or the giant bear. The biggest enemy was the tiny invisible things that make food go bad. They didn't know about germs, but they knew that if they left meat out in a warm tent, it would soon smell bad, turn a strange color, and make everyone who ate it very sick. They called this the invisible thief because it stole the life-giving food right from under their noses. They knew that to stay alive, they had to pause the meat. They had to stop time itself so that the food they found in the autumn would still be good in the middle of a January blizzard. This required a level of planning and thinking ahead that was far beyond any other animal on the planet. They had to become the masters of the invisible world just to stay alive in the visible one. Every action they took was a calculation for the future, a way to ensure that the children born in the spring would have enough to eat through the dark winter months. The first way they did this was by using the earth itself. They were the world's first experts in keeping things cold. They looked at the ground and saw a secret tool that nature had provided. Even though the top layer of the snow was soft, if you dug down just a little bit, you hit something very different. This was the permafrost. It was dirt that had been frozen solid for thousands of years. It was as cold as the inside of a freezer and as hard as a mountain of rock. When the tribe caught a large animal like a bison or a mammoth, they would immediately start to build an ice cellar. This was a long and difficult job that required the strength of the whole group. They didn't have metal shovels or pickaxes. Instead, they used the shoulder, bones of giant elk, and the tusks of mammoths that had died long ago. They would sit in the snow for hours, hacking away at the frozen ground piece by piece. The sound of the bone hitting the frozen earth was a rhythmic thud that echoed through the valley. They would dig a hole 4 or 5 feet deep, reaching the heart of the permafrost where the temperature never changed. No matter how much the sun shone during the day, they had to be extremely careful to choose a spot that was high enough on a hill so that it wouldn't flood when the snow finally started to melt in the spring. If the hole filled with water, the meat would rot and the tribe would have nothing to eat. They would line these deep pits with large, flat stones that they had gathered from the riverbeds during the summer when the water was low. Over the stones, they would place the thick, hairy skins of animals to keep the dirt away from the meat. Once the meat was cut into large chunks and lowered into the pit, they would pack it with layers of clean, hard snow. They would press the snow down with their feet and heavy stones until it turned into solid, clear ice. This was a cold vault, a place where the winter was trapped forever. Inside this hole, the meat was protected from the air and the sun. It was essentially locked in time. Scientists today have found some of these ancient pits in the ground, and they found that meat kept this way can stay good for many, many months. Our ancestors had discovered that the very ice that was trying to kill them was also the thing that could save them. It was a giant freezer that covered the entire continent. They would mark the spot with a specific rock or a sign that only the members of the tribe understood so that they could find it again, even if a massive blizzard covered the entire valley in a fresh layer of white. This mark was a secret promise that there would be food even in the darkest night. It was the first time in history that humans saved for the future on a giant scale. But they didn't just dig holes in the dirt. They also understood how water worked. In the autumn, when the lakes were starting to freeze, but the ice was still thin enough to break, they would use a different trick to save their food. They would put large chunks of meat and fat into bags made of tough, waterproof leather. They would add heavy river stones to the bags to make them very heavy. Then they would walk out onto the ice or use a small boat made of skins to drop the bags into the deepest part of the lake. They knew a secret about water that most people today have forgotten. At the very bottom of a frozen lake, the water is always just a little bit above freezing. It never turns to solid ice at the bottom, and it never gets warm. It stays at the perfect temperature to keep meat fresh without letting it get what we call freezer burn. Freezer burn happens when dry air touches meat and ruins it. But underwater, the meat stays perfect. When the deep hunger of midwinter arrived and the tribe was running low on food, the hunters would return to the lake. They would spend hours chopping a hole in the ice, which might be 3 feet thick by then. They would use long hooks made of bone and ropes made of twisted hide to pull the heavy bags back up. They were using the weight and the cold of the water to hide their food and keep it fresh, like a natural underwater refrigerator. They understood the science of the world before there were even words for it, and they used that knowledge to keep their children fed. They saw the lake as a silent partner in their survival, a deep, dark room where time stood still. While these cold pits and lakes were great, they had one major problem. You couldn't take them with you. The Ice Age was a world where people had to move frequently to follow the animals as they moved across the giant plains. They needed food that was light, easy to carry, and wouldn't rot even if there was no ice nearby. They had to solve the problem of water weight. Fresh meat is mostly made of water, and water is where the rot begins. If you take the water out, the meat becomes like a piece of wood or a strip of leather. It becomes much lighter, and it can stay good for a very long time in a dry bag. This was the second great secret of survival, the art of drying and smoking. They would use their sharpest stone knives to cut the meat into very thin strips, almost like ribbons. They had to be very precise, making sure to remove every bit of fat from these strips because fat can spoil faster than the meat itself. This job was often done by the elders and the children, sitting by the fire and working with incredible patience. They would talk as they worked, passing down the wisdom of how to use the knives to the next generation. Each strip of meat was a piece of the future, a promise that no one would go hungry when the storms came. They worked together, their hands moving in a steady rhythm, turning a dead animal into a supply of energy that could be carried on a person's back. Imagine a long rack made of willow branches, standing on a high, windy ridge near the camp. Draped over these branches are hundreds of thin, red strips of reindeer meat and fish. The tribe would choose a spot where the wind was the strongest and the air was the driest. In the Ice Age, the cold air was very dry because all the moisture had already fallen as snow. This dry wind acted like a giant invisible sponge. It would blow across the meat all day and all night, slowly pulling the water out of every tiny fiber. Over the course of a week, the meat would change. It would shrink and get much darker. It would turn from a soft, wet red to a hard, dry black. This was the birth of what we now call jerky. By removing the water, the ancestors were building a wall that the invisible thief could not climb. Tiny things that rot food need moisture to live, and without it, they simply cannot exist. A hunter could put a whole week's worth of this dried meat into a small leather bag that weighed almost nothing. It was the world's first energy bar. They could eat it while they were walking, or they could soak it in a little bit of hot water by the fire to make a warm, salty soup that would bring the strength back to their limbs. The wind, which they often feared for its bite, had become their most important worker. It was a silent partner that worked for free, day and night, to help them save their lives. In places where the air was damp or there was too much fog from the ice, the wind wasn't enough to dry the meat. In those places, they used the power of the fire in a very specific way. They would build small tents made of wooden poles and thick animal hides. Inside, they would start a very special kind of fire. They didn't want big, hot, dancing flames that would cook the meat. They wanted a lot of thick, gray smoke. They would use green branches from willow trees, juniper bushes, or birch bark that would smolder and burn very slowly. They would hang the strips of meat high up in the top of the tent where the smoke was the thickest and the air was the warmest. This wasn't just to make the meat taste like the forest. The smoke from a wood fire is full of natural chemicals that act like a coat of armor. As the smoke moved around the meat, it would leave a sticky, invisible layer on the surface. This layer was like a shield that killed any germs that tried to land on it. It also kept meat flies and other bugs away. The meat was being protected in two ways at once. The heat of the fire was drying it out, and the smoke was painting it with a layer of protection. This allowed them to preserve food even in the dark, damp forests where the wind didn't blow as hard. The fire was no longer just for warmth. It was a way to save their future. They learned to smell the smoke and know exactly which tree would give the best protection. They were learning the language of the forest and the fire. The most amazing food they ever invented, however, was something we now call pemmican. This was the ultimate superfood of the Stone Age, and it is still used by people who travel to the coldest parts of the world today. To make it, they would take their dried, smoked meat and put it on a large flat stone. They would use another heavy stone to grind the meat into a fine brown powder. This took a lot of strength and many hours of work, as they had to crush every single part until it was as soft as flour. Then they would take the hard, white fat from around the animal's kidneys, the part that doesn't melt easily, and melt it over a fire until it was a clear golden liquid. They would mix the meat powder with the hot fat and add a handful of dried berries that they had gathered and dried. During the short, sunny summer, they might use crowberries, blueberries, or cranberries, depending on what was growing near their camp. They would stir this mixture until it was a thick paste, and then press it into small cakes or bags made of animal skin. When this mixture cooled down, it became as hard as a brick and as heavy as a stone. It was a masterpiece of planning that provided everything a human needed to live. In the extreme cold, pemmican was a masterpiece because it was perfect for the ice age. The fat gave the body the energy it needed to stay warm during a 3-day blizzard when you couldn't leave your tent. The meat gave the muscles the strength to carry heavy loads across the tundra. And the berries were the most important part of all. They were full of things that kept the body healthy. Without them, people who eat only meat would get a terrible disease where their teeth would fall out and their skin would start to bruise for no reason. We call this scurvy today. By putting berries in the pemmican, the ancestors were making a medicine as well as a meal. They didn't know the modern words for these things, but they knew that the berries kept the sickness away. Pemmican was practically indestructible. You could get it wet, You could freeze it, or you could leave it in a hot tent for a year, and it would never go bad. It was a concentrated battery of life that allowed humans to travel across entire continents without ever needing to stop and hunt. It was the secret fuel that allowed us to move into places where no other animal could survive. It was the invention that proved that humans were the ones who decided how they would live, regardless of the weather. It gave them the freedom to explore and to dream. But saving the food and making it last was only the first half of the struggle. The second half was a war of the minds against the other creatures of the ice. In the Ice Age, humans weren't the only ones who were hungry. The smell of drying meat or a fresh kill was like a dinner bell that could be heard and smelled for miles by the most specialized hunters in history. Every wolf, every fox, and every giant raven was looking for a free meal. But there was one creature that was the most terrifying thief of all. This was the wolverine. A wolverine is not a very large animal, but it is the strongest and meanest creature in the snow. It has teeth that can crush a frozen mammoth bone like it is a cracker. It has long, curved claws that can dig through ice and rock, and most importantly, it has a nose that is so sensitive it can smell a piece of hidden meat through many feet of solid snow and stone. If a wolverine found the tribe's food, it wouldn't just eat what it wanted. It would ruin the rest so that no one else could eat it. For a family in the middle of a hungry winter, a wolverine discovery was a death sentence. To protect their life savings, the ancestors became masters of hiding. They didn't put all their food in one single place because that was too risky. Instead, they created a network of hidden spots called caches. These were supply spots scattered all over their territory, sometimes many miles apart. Each one was built like a little fortress. In places where there were many rocks, they would build a stone tower. They would pile the meat on a large, flat rock and then spend hours moving heavy river stones to build a giant pile over it. They would fit the stones together so tightly like a giant puzzle that a fox's nose couldn't even find a crack to sniff through. They were using the weight and the mass of the earth to lock up their treasures. A starving wolf might claw at the stones for a day, but unless it had the strength of 5 men, it would never be able to move them. They would often choose spots that were exposed to the constant wind so that the snow wouldn't pile up too high and cover the stones completely. They were playing a game of hide and seek where the prize was life itself. They learned to think like the animals around them so they could stay one step ahead. In the forests, where there were no large rocks, they used a strategy called the high ledge. They would find 2 tall, straight trees that grew close together and build a wooden platform high up in the air. Far above the reach of a jumping wolf or a standing bear, they would use their stone axes to peel the bark off the tree trunks to make them very smooth and slippery so that animals couldn't climb up. They would hang the meat bags from the very center of the platform, dangling them on ropes made of hide. It was a clever use of the shape of the world. By putting the food in the air, they forced the animals to fight against gravity. But their smartest trick of all was the fake cache. The elders knew that they couldn't hide the smell of meat completely from a determined predator. So They would leave a small pile of old, dry bones and low-quality scraps in a very obvious place. They would make sure that spot smelled very strong. While the wolves and wolverines were busy fighting over the trash pile, the tribe's real high-quality food was hidden half a mile away, buried under the bed of a frozen stream or inside a hollow tree that had been sealed with thick mud and ice to hide the scent. This required the humans to think 2 steps ahead of every other animal. They were the world's first experts at keeping things safe. The biggest mystery of all was how the tribe found these hidden spots again. There were no maps, no paper, and no markers that they could leave behind. In the winter, the whole world looked exactly the same, just endless white hills and black trees if you forgot where your cache was, or if the landscape changed because of a massive snowstorm. Your family would starve. To solve this, the ancestors used the most beautiful technology of all, the power of the song. The elders of the tribe were the keepers of the song maps. These were long, rhythmic poems or songs that described the landscape in perfect, step-by-step detail. A song wasn't just music, it was a map. A song might go like this. Walk toward the mountain that looks like a sleeping mammoth until the sun is on your left shoulder. Find the rock that was split by the ancient lightning. Turn your face toward the wind of the north until you reach the 3 birch trees that stand together like sisters. Under the sister on the left, beneath the stone shaped like a hawk's head, lies the heart of the bison. These songs were the software of survival. By putting the directions into a rhyme or a catchy melody, they made it almost impossible to forget the tiny details. The children would sit by the fire every night and practice these songs until they knew every single word by heart. They would sing them while they were sewing their clothes, while they were cooking their dinner, and while they were walking through the snow. If a hunter got lost in a storm, he could sing his way back home by recognizing the landmarks in the lyrics. If a family was starving in a different part of the valley, they could sing their way to the nearest food cache, even if they had never been there before. Information was more valuable than any spear or any knife, because information was the only way to find the food that was hidden from the world. The person who knew the most songs was often the most important person in the tribe, because they held the keys to the pantry in their mind. They were the living libraries of the Ice Age, carrying the entire map of their world inside their heads. They proved that the voice was just as powerful a tool as the hand, and that memory was the most important wall against the cold. Beyond the tools and the songs, surviving the Great Hunger required a massive change in how people thought and how they felt about each other. In our modern world, we are used to getting what we want right now. But in the Ice Age, that kind of thinking would get you killed. The tribe had to learn to wait. This is a very simple but very hard idea. It means waiting for something better later, instead of taking what you have now. Imagine you are a hunter who hasn't had a full warm meal in a week. Your stomach is growling and your legs feel weak. You are walking through the snow and you find a frozen deer that has died in the cold. Your every instinct, every nerve in your body is screaming for you to sit down and eat as much as you can right then. But you don't. You have the discipline to stop. You carry that deer all the way back to the camp, which might be miles away. You help the elders dry it and smoke it. You help them pack it into a cache that you might not be allowed to touch for another 3 months. You are saving your life today so that your children can live tomorrow. It was a mental victory that was just as hard as any physical battle. This was the start of what we call the social contract. It was the realization that by sharing the hunger and working together as a single unit, everyone's chance of staying alive went up. It was a powerful and beautiful kind of trust. You had to trust that the person sleeping next to you would save the food just as much as you would. You had to trust that the elders knew which song to sing when the snow got too deep to see the rocks. This trust is what made humans different from any other animal. We didn't just hunt in packs like wolves. We planned in groups like a single giant mind. We shared the future as well as the present. This mental shift allowed us to build families and tribes that could last for thousands of years through the worst conditions imaginable. We were no longer just animals reacting to the world. We were building a world of our own through cooperation. This mental strength was the real fire that kept the tribe warm. It was the foundation of everything that makes us human today. Our ability to work together and to care for those who cannot care for themselves. They also learned how to save their energy in a way that was very disciplined and quiet. During the darkest months of the Great Hunger, when the storms outside were too strong to even stand up, the tribe would enter a state of resting. They didn't go out and run around in the snow for no reason. They didn't waste energy on things that didn't matter. They stayed inside their bone huts, huddling together for warmth under layers of thick fur. They would spend their days quietly. They would tell stories, repair their leather clothes with bone needles, and fix their stone tools. They moved as little as possible to make sure they didn't burn the precious energy they had saved in their caches. They were like the bears sleeping in the caves, slowing down their hearts and their minds to let the winter pass over them. They learned that silence and stillness were also tools for survival. They mastered the art of the wait, knowing that the sun would eventually return if they were only patient enough to survive the dark. This stillness allowed them to think and to imagine. They also had a very strict rule about who got the food first. When the caches were opened, the elders made sure that the children and the nursing mothers were fed before anyone else, even before the hunters who had provided the meat. They knew that the future of the tribe was more important than the comfort of the adults. The hunters would often go to bed with empty stomachs so that the little ones could have a small piece of pemmican to keep them growing. This self-discipline and self-sacrifice is what allowed humans to survive in places where even the biggest and toughest animals eventually died out. We didn't just have better spears, we had a better way of looking after each other. We had a moral compass that pointed toward the survival of the group rather than just the self. This was the birth of kindness and the birth of community. We learned that the hunger could be beaten if we all pulled together with a single heart. We were no longer just survivors. We were a family, and that family was the strongest force on the planet. As we sit in our warm, bright homes today, it is almost impossible to imagine how it truly felt to live through the Great Hunger. For us, having no food usually means the store is out of our favorite brand, or the power goes out for a few hours. We live in a world of plenty, where there is so much food that we often forget where it comes from, and we throw away much of what we buy. To an Ice Age survivor, our modern world would look like a dream, a place of magic where no one ever has to worry about the invisible thief. But the secrets of those survivors are still hidden deep inside us. When you feel a sudden craving for something salty or fatty, that is your Ice Age brain reminding you to stock up on energy for a winter that isn't coming. It is a biological memory that has been passed down through 1,000 generations. When you feel a deep sense of peace, when your kitchen is full of food, that is the same feeling of safety our ancestors felt when their caches were full. When you use a little rhyme or a trick to remember a song or a name, you are using the exact same parts of your brain that the elders used to remember the song maps of the tundra. We are the direct result of those thousands of years of planning, patience, and memory. The mastery of the frozen earth, the dry wind, and the hidden cache allowed humans to do something no other animal had ever done. We conquered the seasons. We broke the cycle of eating only when food was right in front of us. We learned how to store time in the form of food. This was perhaps the most important step in all of human history. Once our bellies were full and we weren't worried about starving to death every single morning, we finally had the time and the energy to start thinking about other things. We were no longer slaves to the stomach. We were no longer just chasing the next meal. We had become the masters of our own lives. We had the time to sit in the back of a cave and paint beautiful animals on the walls using colors made from the earth. We had the time to invent the first musical instruments, like flutes made from the hollow bones of birds. We had the time to look up at the bright stars in the sky and wonder what they were and how they moved. The great hunger didn't break us, it made us. It forced us to become smarter, more patient, more cooperative, and more kind to one another. It was the fire that forged the human spirit into something new. It taught us that we could overcome any challenge if we had a clever plan and if we had each other. The cold was a harsh teacher, and we were the students who learned how to win. We turned the hunger into a spark of genius that would one day lead to everything we have today. The great hunger was the moment we began to build our world. The secrets of the permafrost and the smoke tent didn't disappear. When the Ice Age finally ended and the glaciers melted, they were passed down from father to son and from mother to daughter for thousands of years. They were the foundation of the first farms and the first cities. Even today, the way we run our entire world is based on the ancient idea of the cache. Money is just a modern way of saving energy, so we can use it later. Our giant grocery stores are just high-tech versions of the stone towers the ancestors built in the snow. Our freezers and refrigerators are just modern versions of the permafrost pits. We are still using the exact same logic that kept us alive when the mammoths were roaming the earth. We have just made the tools look a little more complicated, but the goal is the same: to make sure there is food for tomorrow. Every time you save for the future, you are using the logic of the Ice Age cache. But as we live in our world of plenty, we should try to remember the lesson of the great hunger. We should remember that food is life and that it should be respected, not wasted. We should remember the discipline, the sharing, and the trust that kept our ancestors alive through the long, dark nights. They didn't have much, but they used everything they had with wisdom and care. They understood that they were part of a delicate balance with the nature around them. They didn't take more than they needed, and they always thought about the tomorrow that was waiting in the snow. This ancient wisdom is something we can still learn from today as we face our own challenges in a changing world. We are the survivors of the frost, and we carry the fire of that survival in our hearts. Every time we share a meal or plan for the future, we are honoring the people who sat in the dark 30,000 years ago and decided to survive. They were the ones who proved that the human spirit is stronger than any winter. So, the next time you open your freezer or see a piece of smoked meat, take a moment to listen to the wind of the past. Remember the song lines that were sung by the fire and the Wolverine wars that were fought in the dark. Remember the pemmican cakes that were made with love and the ice cellars that were dug with bone. Remember the elders singing the map of the world so that no one would ever be lost. We have learned that the winter is not the enemy. The winter is the teacher. It taught us that the greatest strength a human being can have is not the ability to kill, but the ability to save. We are the children of the planners, the scientists of the frost, and the singers of the map. We survived the great hunger because we learned how to turn a world of white into a world of hope. We are the masters of time, and we are the guardians of the fire. The story of the great hunger is a story of victory. It is the story of how humans looked at an empty, freezing world and found a way to fill it with life and meaning. It is the story of how we used our imagination to beat the cold. And as we finish this chapter, we realize that we are the living proof of that success. Every single person alive today is the descendant of someone who was smart enough to build a cache and patient enough to wait for the spring. We are the proof that the great hunger was defeated. We carry that victory in our blood and in our minds every single day of our lives. It is the victory of the mind over the ice, and it is the foundation of everything we are today. The hunger taught us to be human, but while the hunger was a quiet and slow battle that lasted for months, there were other dangers in the Ice Age that were very fast and very loud. The world of 30,000 years ago was not just a place of snow and silence. It was also a world of sharp teeth, silent shadows, and glowing eyes. There were creatures in the dark that were looking for the same food we were, and sometimes they were looking for us. To stay alive, we didn't just have to save our food. We had to learn how to escape the hunters of the night. We had to learn how to disappear when the shadows grew long across the snow. We had to learn how to use fire as a shield and the earth as a hiding place. The struggle for food was over for the day, but the struggle for safety was just beginning. We had filled our pantry, but now we had to defend our lives. As the pale sun sets and the purple shadows grow long across the tundra, the tribe gathers their things and moves quickly toward the safety of their home. They have their dried meat and their pemmican, but they also have their fears. They know that the saber-toothed tiger and the giant cave bear are waking up in the distance. They know that the dark is the time of the predator, and they are the prey. They must be ready. They must be silent. They must be fast. The next part of our journey will take us to the edge of the night, where the true monsters lived and where humans had to be the most creative to stay alive. The wind is dying down and the world is getting very, very quiet. The fire is glowing in the dark, but it is just a small light in a very big and dangerous world. The caches are full and the tribe is safe for now. But as the moon rises over the ice, the shadows are moving. There are eyes watching from the dark and teeth that shine in the night. The great hunger has been pushed back, but the night's edge is just beginning. We have learned how to feed ourselves, but now we must learn how to protect ourselves. Rest now, for the next challenge is waiting in the dark. We have outsmarted the winter, but can we outsmart the shadows? The Ice Age is a harsh master, and the lessons never stop. But we are ready. We are the survivors. We are the children of the frost. As the pale sun of the Ice Age dropped below the edge of the world, a different kind of life began to stir in the frozen valley. During the day, the tundra was a place of bright, blinding white, where the primary struggle was finding food and staying warm under the heavy clouds. But as the shadows grew long and the sky turned into a deep, heavy purple velvet, the world no longer belonged to the humans. The night belonged to the hunters that had been watching from the trees and the caves. This was the time of the great cats and the giant bears. It was a time when the human tribe, despite all their spears and their clever stone tools, became the ones being tracked through the snow. The darkness was not just a lack of light. It was a physical presence that seemed to hide 1,000 pairs of glowing eyes that reflected the moon. This is the third part of our journey, the story of how we survived the things that hunted us when the world went dark. It is a story about the secret of the silent ghost, the tactical retreat to the high ledge, and the power of the shield of flame. It is the story of how we learned to disappear when the shadows became dangerous, and how we turned our fear into a plan for safety. To understand the danger of the night, we first have to imagine the monsters that lived in the shadows 30,000 years ago. The most terrifying of all was the saber-toothed tiger. This was a creature that was built for the secret attack. It was shorter and much heavier than a modern lion, with massive front legs that could pin a heavy bison to the ground. But its most famous weapons were its teeth. It had 2 giant, curved blades made of ivory that hung down 7 inches from its upper jaw. These teeth were not for chewing food. They were for a single lethal strike to the throat. The saber-tooth did not chase its prey across the open snow for miles. It was a master of the wait. It would hide in the tall, dry grass or behind a frozen boulder, its tawny fur blending perfectly with the winter colors of the tundra. It would stay as still as a stone for hours, barely breathing, until a human walked just a little too close to its hiding spot. The human would never see the tiger until the moment it leaped through the air. Then there was the cave bear. This was a giant that made the grizzly bear of today look like a small cub. When it stood up on its back legs, it reached 10 feet into the air. It was a mountain of muscle and thick, shaggy fur that lived in the very places humans wanted to go, the warm, dry caves. Unlike the saber-tooth, the cave bear did not always want to eat you. It was a territorial king. If you entered its home, it would crush you not out of hunger, but out of power. And finally, there was the cave hyena. These were not the small scavengers we see today. They were as large as small ponies, with jaws that could crush a mammoth's leg bone like it was a dry twig. They hunted in packs, using an eerie, laughing bark to talk to each other as they circled a human camp in the dark, looking for a child who had wandered too far from the fire or a hunter who was too tired to watch his back. For a human tribe, every night was a battle for the right to see the morning sun, and every morning was a victory over the monsters of the dark. The first secret of survival was the art of being a silent ghost. The ancestors realized very early that in a world of super predators, being noticed was a death sentence. They had to learn how to move through the landscape without making a single sound. They were the world's first masters of stealth. They started with their feet. A human walking in the snow normally makes a loud, rhythmic, crunching sound that can be heard by a predator's sensitive ears for a very long distance. To solve this, they changed their boots. They wrapped their reindeer skin shoes in extra layers of soft fur, with the hair facing outward. This muffler effect softened the impact of their steps, turning a loud crunch into a soft, almost invisible rustle. They also learned how to time their movement with the world around them. They would only take a step when the wind blew hard through the trees, or when a distant mammoth made a loud, trumpeting noise. They used the natural sounds of the world to hide the sounds of their own bodies, moving only when the world was noisy and staying perfectly still when the world was quiet. They also mastered the art of visual disappearance. They understood that a solid, dark shape moving against the white snow was an easy target for a hungry cat. So they became masters of camouflage. They would wear different furs depending on where they were traveling. If they were in the open snow, they wore the pure white fur of the Arctic fox or the mountain hare. If they were in the forest, they wore the dappled, brownish-gray fur of the reindeer. They would even use black soot from their fires to draw lines across their faces and arms, breaking up the human shape so that a predator's brain wouldn't recognize them as a person. They learned to move with a specific posture, keeping low to the ground and avoiding the tall silhouette that stood out against the horizon. They were training themselves to be part of the background, as invisible as the frost on a rock or the mist in a valley. They learned that the best way to win a fight was to never let the fight begin. But stealth was only the first layer of defense. Sometimes, no matter how quiet you are, the predator finds your trail. The ancestors were expert animal watchers, and they knew that every animal has a trigger for its hunting instinct. They knew that if you ran away from a big cat in a panic, the cat would chase you even faster. Running triggered the cat's brain to think of you as food. So they developed the second secret, the tactical retreat. They didn't just run, they moved toward safety with a very specific plan. They knew that a human's greatest advantage was our ability to climb and use our hands. A heavy saber-tooth or a giant cave bear is not a good climber. Their bodies are built for power on the flat ground, not for agility in the heights. A human can pull themselves up a tree or a cliff, but a 600-pound cat cannot follow. The tribe would always look for a high ledge or a steep cliff near their camp. This was their sanctuary. If a pack of hyenas or a tiger was spotted in the distance, the tribe would move toward the ledge. They would use ropes made of twisted leather and sinew to pull the children and the elders up onto a high, narrow shelf of rock. They would then pull the ropes up after them so nothing could climb up. They would sit on that ledge, looking down at the predators who were pacing below in the snow, unable to reach them. They were using the shape of the world to build a wall that didn't require any stones. They also looked for caves with very narrow entrances. A human can squeeze through a gap only 18 inches wide, but a cave bear or a large cat cannot. They would find these squeeze caves where they could hide in the deep dark, knowing that the giant monsters were stuck outside, huffing and clawing at the entrance, but unable to get their massive shoulders through the stone. However, the most powerful tool they ever discovered was the third secret, the shield of flame. In the Ice Age, fire was more than just a source of warmth and a way to cook meat. It was a weapon of psychological warfare. Most animals have a primal, deep-seated fear of fire. To them, it is a piece of the sun that has fallen to earth, a strange and biting creature that eats wood and breathes smoke. The ancestors learned how to harness this fear to keep themselves safe. They didn't just build a small fire in the middle of their camp. They built a perimeter of protection. At night, they would build several fires in a wide circle around their sleeping area. They would keep these fires burning all night long, using heavy logs of pine and birch that would throw off bright sparks and make loud, popping sounds like tiny thunderclaps. These fires did three very important things. First, they ruined the night vision of the predators. A big cat's eyes are designed to see in very low light. When they look at a bright, flickering fire, their pupils shrink instantly, and they become temporarily blinded to what is happening behind the flames. The fire created a wall of light that the predators couldn't see through. Second, the smell of the smoke was a sign of danger. To a predator, the smell of smoke meant a forest fire, a danger they had been evolved to stay away from. And third, the fire allowed the humans to see the predators first. As a saber-tooth circled the camp, the light of the fire would catch its eyes, making them glow like two yellow lamps in the dark. This gave the hunters a clear target. They would take long wooden poles and dip the ends in animal fat, lighting them to create fire spears. If a predator got too close, they wouldn't try to stab it with a stone point. They would thrust the burning torch toward its face. The heat and the sudden burst of light were usually enough to send even the hungriest tiger running back into the shadows. The mastery of fire also led to the invention of the night watch. This was the first time in human history that people took turns being awake to protect the group. It was a beautiful act of social trust and cooperation. While the mothers and children slept, 2 or 3 hunters would sit by the fires, their spears ready, their eyes constantly scanning the tree line. They had a language of soft signals. A quiet whistle meant, "I hear something moving." A rhythmic tapping on a wooden shield meant, "Everyone wake up, danger is near." This constant vigilance meant that the tribe was never truly surprised. They were like a single animal with a dozen sets of ears and eyes that never all closed at once. This organized defense was something no other animal on Earth could do. Wolves might protect their pack, but they didn't have the shield of flame or the sanctuary of the heights. The human tribe was becoming a fortress made of people. Beyond the physical tools, survival at the night's edge required a massive change in how humans dealt with their own fear. Fear is a powerful emotion that can make a person freeze or make a mistake. In the Ice Age, if you froze in fear, you died. The ancestors developed techniques to regulate their fear. They used stories and songs to turn the predators from mysterious monsters into predictable neighbors. By the fire at night, the elders would teach the children about the habits of the saber-tooth. They would explain its favorite hiding spots, its unique smells, and its weaknesses. They turned the tiger into a thing that can be understood and beaten. They used humor and mockery, telling stories of how a clever child outsmarted a clumsy, slow bear. By laughing at the monsters, they took away their power over the human mind. They were training the young minds to be calm and analytical even when their hearts were pounding in their chests. They also understood the concept of group intimidation. A single human looks like a small, weak meal to a hungry hyena. But a group of 20 humans, all standing together, holding flaming torches and screaming in a deep, rhythmic voice, looks like a single giant, multi-headed monster that is much too dangerous to attack. They learned how to size up their presence. When a predator approached, they wouldn't hide or cower. They would stand tall, lift their heavy furs to make themselves look twice as large, and create a wall of noise. They were using the predator's own instinct for self-preservation against it. A predator survives by being successful in its hunts and avoiding injury. If a tiger gets a broken leg, it cannot hunt and it will starve. Therefore, a predator is actually very cautious. If a human tribe looks like they are going to put up a fight that might result in an injury for the cat, the cat will usually choose to look for an easier meal elsewhere. The ancestors were experts at bluffing the world's most dangerous killers, proving that the mind is the strongest weapon of all. We also have to look at the architecture of the cave and the camp. When we think of cavemen, we often imagine people sitting in the dark at the very back of a hole in the rock. But the ancestors were much smarter than that. They understood airflow and how to plan an exit. They would choose caves that had more than one entrance, so they could never be cornered by a bear. They would build their sleeping areas near the front of the cave, but behind a screen of dry brush and fire. This let the smoke from their fires escape out the entrance, while keeping the warmth and the protection inside. They would also spread warning mats near the entrance of their sleeping area. These were layers of very dry, crunchy leaves or small bird bones that would make a loud, snapping noise if anything stepped on them in the dark. It was a prehistoric alarm system. If a hyena tried to sneak in while the watchman was looking the other way, the crunch of the warning mat would wake the whole tribe. before the predator could get close. In the forests, where there were no caves to hide in, they built something called the bramble fort. They would find a thicket of thorny bushes and use their stone axes to cut more thorns, piling them in a circle to create a wall that was 5 feet high and very thick. They would leave only one small hidden tunnel to get inside, which they would block with a large pile of thorns at night. This thorn wall was a mechanical barrier that used the pain of the plant to protect the human. No predator, no matter how hungry, wanted to push through 1,000 sharp needles to get to the meat inside. Inside the bramble fort, the tribe was safe. They would build their fire in the center, and the smoke would filter through the thorns, further confusing the noses of the wolves outside who were trying to catch their scent. They were turning the forest itself into a house that could not be broken into. There is also a fascinating and beautiful part of this story involving the very first friendship between humans and another predator. During the late Ice Age, a small group of wolves realized that humans were excellent hunters who always had scraps of meat and fat left over at their camps. At the same time, humans realized that wolves had much better ears and noses than they did. They could hear a footstep in the snow from a mile away. Slowly, over thousands of years, the bravest wolves and the most patient humans began to work together. This was the birth of the sentinel dog. These early dogs would sleep at the very edge of the human camp, just outside the circle of fire. Their job was simple. If anything approached in the dark, they would bark or growl. This sound was the ultimate alarm. It was a sound that told the saber-tooth that the humans were now awake. The fires were being stoked, and the spears were ready. In exchange for this security service, the humans gave the wolves the bones and the tough bits of meat they couldn't eat. This was a mutual defense pact that changed the history of the world. It meant that the Night's Edge was no longer a place where humans were alone. They had a partner who shared the watch with them. As the thousands of years passed, the balance of power on the tundra began to shift. Humans became so good at stealth, so good at using fire, and so good at tactical defense that they were no longer just escaping the predators. They began to compete with them for the best territory. They would use their shield of flame to drive a cave bear out of a prime cave, taking the warm home for themselves. They would use their atlatls to kill a saber-tooth from a distance, turning the great hunter of men into a warm rug for the hearth. This was the moment when the Night's Edge began to retreat. The darkness was still there, but it was no longer a place of absolute terror. It was a place where humans had learned to thrive. We were no longer the prey. We were the masters of the night. The mastery of the night teaches us about the power of vigilance and the strength of the group. It shows us that survival is not just about having the biggest muscles or the sharpest teeth. It is about having the most organized mind and the ability to trust the person standing next to you. The Night's Edge was the fire that forged our social intelligence. It forced us to develop a complex language to share signals, to develop deep trust, to allow others to sleep while we watched, and to develop the first systems of law to make sure everyone did their part. We learned that the person who stays awake to watch the fire is just as important as the person who brings home the mammoth. Every life in the tribe was connected by by the circle of the flame. We learned that we are strongest when we look out for one another and when we use our creativity to solve the problems that scare us the most. As we sit in our modern homes today, we still feel the echoes of the night's edge in our own bodies. Have you ever felt a sudden shiver when you walk into a dark room alone? Have you ever felt the urge to check under the bed or make sure the door is locked even when you know you are safe? That is your Ice Age brain reminding you of the saber-tooth and the hyena that used to wait in the shadows. It is a biological memory of the 30,000 years we spent as the prey of the night. But we also carry the victory of the flame when we gather around a campfire with our friends, or even when we light a small candle in a quiet room. We feel a deep sense of peace and safety. That is the fire shield memory. It is the feeling of being inside the circle, protected by the light and the people we love. It is the memory of the time we beat the dark, the secrets of the silent, ghost, and the shield of flame allowed humans to survive the most dangerous neighborhood in the history of the earth. We didn't just survive, we learned how to dominate. We learned that the shadows are only scary if you don't have a plan to meet them. We learned that the dark is only a place of death if you are standing alone without a fire. By the end of the Ice Age, the great cats and the giant bears were slowly dying out as the world changed. But the humans were flourishing. We had proven that a creature with a fire, a friend, and a clever mind could outlast a creature with 1,000 sharp teeth. We had turned the night from a time of terror into a time of rest and storytelling. We had claimed the 24 hours of the day for ourselves. So, the next time you see a dark forest or look up at a bright moon in a quiet place, take a moment to think about the bramble forts and the high ledges of the past. Remember the night watchman who sat in the cold and the fire spears that kept the tigers away. Remember the first wolves who sat at the edge of the light and decided to become our friends. We have learned that the best way to escape a predator is to be too smart to be caught. We have learned that the best way to beat the night is to carry the light with us wherever we go. The night's edge has been pushed back forever, and the world is much safer today because our ancestors were brave enough to sit in the dark and wait for the dawn. They taught us that no matter how big the monster is, a small spark and a good plan can turn the tide. The story of our survival is a story of light winning over darkness. It is a story of how a small, furless animal used its imagination to build a world where the night is for dreaming, not for hiding. And as the sun finally begins to rise over the frozen ridges of the Ice Age, we see that the tribe has made it through another night. The children are waking up, the fire is being fed fresh wood, and the spears are being checked for the new day's journey. The predators have retreated to their dens, defeated by the intelligence of the humans. The dawn is coming, and with the light, a new kind of power is waking up. It is the power of the hand and the tool. It is the power of the spark of genius. As the pale sun finally climbs over the edge of the frozen world, the light reveals a landscape that is no longer just a place of fear and hunger. For the people of the Ice Age, the morning was a time of action. The predators had retreated to their dens, and the tribe was safe inside the glow of the new day. We often think of these people as primitive, but if we could sit with them by their fire, we would see something truly amazing. We would see the birth of the human mind as we know it today. We would see the world's first inventors, the world's first tailors, and the world's first artists. This is the fourth part of our journey, the story of the spark of genius. It is a story about how a tiny bone with a hole in it saved more lives than any spear. It is a story about how humans learned to draw their memories on the walls of the earth. And it is a story about how we turned simple rocks into a library of tools that could solve any problem. This is the moment in history when humans stopped just reacting to the world and started changing it. To understand the genius of the Ice Age, we have to look at the smallest and most important tool ever made. It wasn't a giant axe or a heavy club, it was the needle. Before the invention of the needle, humans were in deep trouble. They had thick animal furs, but they didn't really have clothes. They would wrap themselves in a heavy skin and tie it with a piece of vine or a leather strap. This worked for a little while, but it had a huge problem. Because the skins were loose, the cold wind could blow right through the gaps. The heat from the person's body would escape, and the person would freeze. Even worse, if you were wearing a giant, heavy bison skin that wasn't fitted to your body, you couldn't run fast. You couldn't climb trees. You were clumsy and slow. Then, about 30,000 years ago, a brilliant mind in a cold cave had an idea. They took a small, thin splinter of bone from a bird or a reindeer. They used a sharp piece of flint to grind that bone until it was as thin and sharp as a thorn. Then they did the hardest part. They used a tiny stone drill to make a perfect round hole in the blunt end of the bone. This was the first needle. It might look simple to us, but it was a revolution. With a needle and a piece of sinew, the strong, stringy part of an animal's leg, humans could finally sew. They stopped wrapping themselves and started tailoring. They could cut the furs to fit their arms and their legs perfectly. They could make sleeves. They could make trousers. They could make hoods. This fitted clothing was the real reason humans were able to live in the coldest places on Earth. By sewing 2 layers of fur together, they created a thermal pocket of air that stayed warm even in a blizzard. They could make waterproof boots that didn't fall off in the deep snow. The needle allowed humans to become environmentally sealed. We didn't need to grow thick hair like a mammoth because we could create our own. This invention changed everything. It meant that a mother could keep her baby warm in a snug pouch against her chest. It meant that a hunter could move as fast as a wolf because his clothes didn't get in the way. The needle was the key that unlocked the rest of the planet for us. It was the first high-tech device, a tool that used precision and engineering to beat the climate. But the genius of our ancestors didn't stop with their clothes. They were also the world's first master chemists and stone workers. We have talked about how they made spears, but they did so much more with rocks. They understood that different stones had different personalities. They knew that flint was sharp and brittle, But granite was tough and heavy. They would travel for days across dangerous mountains and frozen rivers just to find the perfect core of stone. Once they found it, the work of the master craftsman began. This wasn't just hitting a rock with another rock. It was a process of extreme focus and geometry. Imagine a man sitting in the sun, a leather pad on his knee to protect his skin. He holds a piece of flint in one hand and a tool made of hard antler in the other. He isn't hitting the stone hard. He is pressing it at a very specific angle. With a sharp click, a long, thin flake of stone falls off. This flake is thinner than a coin and sharper than a razor. He repeats this over and over, turning a single block of stone into dozens of specialized tools. He makes scrapers to clean the fat off of animal skins. He makes borers to drill holes in wood and bone. He makes knives that can slice through leather like it is butter. These were the first multi-tools. A single hunter could carry a small bag of these stone flakes and have a tool for every possible job. They were the Swiss Army knives of the Ice Age. This ability to think in miniature shows how smart they really were. They were moving away from the big and heavy tools of the past and into the small and precise tools of the future. They even invented composite tools. This is when you take several small pieces and put them together to make a bigger machine. For example, they would take a row of tiny, razor-sharp stone flakes and glue them into a groove in a wooden handle. This created a saw that was much more effective than a single large stone blade. They were using modular design long before we had a word for it. They were learning that the power of a tool isn't in its size, but in the intelligence of its shape. As the day grew warmer, the tribe's genius moved from their hands to their eyes and their voices. One of the most beautiful things our ancestors ever did was leave us a record of their thoughts. We find these records deep inside caves in places where the sun never reaches. These are the cave paintings. For a long time, people thought these were just pretty pictures or doodles made by bored people. But when we look closer, we see that they were much more than that. They were the world's first data storage system. They were a way to save information and share it with people who weren't even born yet. Imagine walking into a deep cave holding a small stone lamp filled with animal fat. The light flickers against the walls. Suddenly, you see a giant bison painted in deep reds and blacks. It looks like it is moving in the firelight. But this isn't just a picture of a bison. If you look at the markings around the animal, you see dots and lines. Some scientists believe these dots were a lunar calendar. They were tracking the moon to know when the bison would return to the valley. They were using the walls of the cave as a giant hard drive to store the science of the seasons. They were the first people to understand that you could take an idea out of your head and put it somewhere else so it wouldn't be forgotten. The paintings were also the world's first training manuals. When a world without schools. How do you teach a child how to hunt a mammoth? You can't just take them out and hope for the best. It's too dangerous. Instead, the elders would bring the young people into the dark heart of the cave. In the flickering light, they would point to the paintings of the animals. They would show the kill zones on the animal's body. They would describe how the herd moves and which animals are the leaders. The cave was a classroom, and the paintings were the projector. They were using art to pass down the survival software of the tribe. This is why we find the same styles of painting in caves that are hundreds of miles apart. It was a common language, a way for different tribes to share the secrets of the world. To make these paintings, they had to be master chemists. They didn't just find paint in a store. They had to invent it. They would find colorful rocks in the earth, red iron, yellow clay, and black charcoal from the fire. They would grind these rocks into a fine powder. Then they had to figure out how to make the powder stick to the wall. They experimented until they found the perfect binder. They mixed the colorful dust with animal fat, vegetable juice, or even their own spit. They used brushes made of animal hair or their own fingers. Sometimes they would even use a hollow bone to blow the paint onto the wall, creating a stencil of their own hands. When you see a handprint on a cave wall today, you are seeing a digital signature from 30,000 years ago. It is a person saying, "I was here, I was smart, and I had a story to tell." This move into symbolic thinking is what made humans the masters of the planet. It means we could think about things that weren't right in front of us. We could talk about the mammoth of the past or the spring of the future. We could make a plan for a hunt that wouldn't happen for 3 days. We could invent stories and myths to explain why the stars moved or why the wind blew. This creativity was a social glue. It brought people together around the fire to listen to legends and songs. It allowed them to build a culture. They started making jewelry out of shells and animal teeth. They made flutes out of bird bones that could play beautiful, haunting melodies. They weren't just surviving. They were living. They were filling their world with meaning. We also have to look at their navigation genius. In the Ice Age, the world was always changing. A forest that was there one year might be buried under ice the next. To stay alive, the ancestors had to be the world's first cartographers or map makers. But they didn't have paper. Instead, they made mental maps and physical markers. They would carve lines into a piece of wood or a flat bone to represent the ridges and rivers of their territory. They would build cairns, piles of stones, on high hills to serve as waypoints. They learned to read the stars like a giant map in the sky. They knew that if they followed a certain star, they would find the summer valley. This ability to spatial think allowed them to travel thousands of miles without getting lost. They were explorers of the unknown, using their imagination to find a path through the white. The creativity of the Ice Age was also found in how they treated their home. They were the world's first architects. In places where there were no caves, they didn't just sit in the snow. They built bone palaces. Imagine a house made of the giant ribs and tusks of mammoths. They would use the heavy skulls as a foundation to hold the house down in the wind. They would weave the ribs together to create a dome and then cover the whole thing with thick, warm hides. They would use the tusks to create a doorway. Inside, they would dig a small pit for a fire and line the floor with soft moss and furs. These houses were a miracle of engineering. They were strong enough to survive a blizzard and warm enough to keep a family safe all winter. They were custom-built environments, proving that humans could make a home anywhere, as long as they had their imagination. There is also a hidden genius in their social organization. They realized that if everyone did the same thing, the tribe was weak. So they invented specialization. One person was the master of the stone tools. Another was the master of the sewing needle. Another was the keeper of the songs and the maps. They were a team where each person's unique talent was used to help everyone else. They understood that diversity was a strength. This social intelligence is what allowed them to build large, successful communities. They would have intertribal gatherings where different groups would meet to trade tools, share stories, and find marriage partners. They were building the first human network, a web of information and friendship that covered the entire continent. As the thousands of years passed, the spark of genius grew into a roar of innovation. By the end of the Ice Age, humans had invented the bow and arrow, the fishing net, and the first boats. They were starting to understand how to plant seeds and how to attract certain animals to their camps. They were on the very edge of the agricultural revolution, the moment when we stopped being hunters and started being farmers. But all of that was only possible because of the creativity born in the snow. The brain power that we used to build our modern world of computers and spaceships is exactly the same brain power that our ancestors used to build a bone needle and a stone lamp. The journey of the creative mind teaches us that we have always been fixers. We have always looked at a problem, like a cold wind or a dark cave, and thought, how can I make this better? It shows us that our greatest weapon isn't a sharp tooth or a strong claw, but our imagination. It shows us that we are a storytelling animal, a creature that needs to find meaning and beauty even in the hardest times. The spark survived the deepest freezes, the loss of the mammoths, and the shifting of the earth. It survived because it was flexible. It could turn a bone into a needle, a rock into a knife, and a cave wall into a book. As we sit in our modern world today, surrounded by high-tech gadgets, we still carry the Ice Age spark inside us. Have you ever felt a sudden rush of excitement when you solve a difficult puzzle? Have you ever felt a sense of peace when you draw a picture or listen to a song? That is your ancient brain celebrating a victory. It is the same feeling that the first tailor felt when the first sleeve was finished. It is the same joy the first artist felt when the bison appeared on the cave wall. We are the children of the Stone Age geniuses, and we carry their creative fire in our hearts every day. The secrets of the needle, the map, and the stone saw allowed humans to do more than just endure the Ice Age. We turned the ice into a studio for our creativity. We turned the cold into a teacher for our engineering. We proved that the human spirit cannot be frozen. By the time the glaciers finally started to melt, we weren't just cave people anymore. We were the masters of innovation, ready to build the first cities and sailed the first seas. We had survived the dark, not by being the strongest, but by being the most ingenious. So, the next time you pick up a needle to fix a button, or use a map to find your way, or see a beautiful piece of art, take a moment to look at your hands. Remember the people who sat in the flickering light of a mammoth fat lamp and figured out how to make those things for the very first time. Remember the bone palaces and the chemical paints. We have learned that the spark of genius is the most powerful force in nature, and that with a little bit of creativity and a lot of cooperation, there is no problem we cannot solve. The primal winter is over, and the human spring is about to begin. As the afternoon sun of the Ice Age begins to dip toward the horizon, the world turns into a sea of orange and gold. The long shadows of the mammoths stretch across the snow, and the air grows even colder than before. For the people of the tribe, this is the time to return to the one place that matters more than any hunting ground or flint mine. This is the time to return to the sanctuary. We have spent our journey learning how to hunt, how to save food, how to hide from monsters, and how to invent tools. But all of those things were done for a single reason: to keep the home safe. This is the fifth and final part of our story. It is the story of the sanctuary. It is a story about how humans built giant houses out of the bones of giants. It is a story about how they found medicine hidden in the green moss and the bark of trees. And most importantly, it is a story about the power of kindness. This is the moment we discover that the greatest invention of the Ice Age wasn't the spear or the needle, but the act of looking after one another. To understand the sanctuary, we first have to look at where the people lived when there were no caves. We often think of cavemen, always living in holes in the rock. But in the giant flat plains of the north, there were no mountains and no caves for hundreds of miles. In these places, the wind was a constant enemy that could freeze a person in minutes. The ancestors had to become the world's first master builders. They looked at the landscape and saw that they had no wood for tall houses and no bricks for walls. But they did have one thing: the remains of the mammoths. They began to build what we now call bone palaces. Imagine a house where the walls are made of giant mammoth skulls piled on top of each other. These skulls were so heavy that even the strongest blizzard couldn't move them. They acted as a foundation, holding the house firmly to the frozen earth. For the roof, the builders used the long, curved ribs of the mammoth. They would lean the ribs toward the center, weaving them together to create a giant dome that looked like the inside of a whale. They would cover this bone frame with layers of heavy mammoth skins, sewing them together with the bone needles we learned about in the last chapter. They would put the hairy side of the skin facing outward to shed the snow and rain, and they would add a second layer of skin on the inside to trap the warmth. To keep the floor dry, they would spread thick layers of soft, green moss and dry grass. This wasn't just a tent. It was a high-tech fortress against the cold. Inside one of these bone houses, the temperature could be 40 degrees warmer than the world outside. A family could sit in comfort while a deadly storm roared just a few inches away. The Bone Palace was a miracle of engineering. It showed that humans didn't need nature to give them a house. They could build one out of the very giants they hunted. It was a place of light, a place of stories, and a place where the next generation was born. But a sanctuary is more than just a roof and walls. A sanctuary is also a place where you go when you are hurt. In the Ice Age, life was very dangerous. A hunter might trip and break a leg. A child might get a deep cut from a sharp stone. In a world of ice, a small wound could quickly turn into a big problem. This is where we see the birth of the world's first doctors. These people were the master observers of the forest and the tundra. They didn't have pharmacies, so they turned to the green world for help. They discovered the secret of the moss bandage. They found a specific kind of white moss that grows in wet areas. This moss was a miracle of nature. It could soak up an incredible amount of liquid, but it also had a secret power. It was naturally clean and could stop germs from growing. When a person was bleeding, the healer would take a clump of this soft moss, press it against the wound, and wrap it with a strip of soft leather. It kept the wound dry and protected, allowing the body to heal itself. They also discovered the medicine of the trees. They noticed that if they chewed on the bark of a willow tree, their headaches would go away and their fevers would drop. They didn't know the chemistry, but they were using the same ingredient we use to make aspirin today. They found nature's glue in the resin of pine trees, which they used to seal small cuts and keep the cold air out of the skin. They learned how to use fire as a medical tool, heating flat stones and wrapping them in fur to create hot water bottles for aching muscles and cold joints. This was the start of the science of healing. It wasn't about magic or spells. It was about testing things, remembering what worked, and passing that knowledge down to the children. The sanctuary was a laboratory of life, where the tribe learned that nature provided the cure for almost every sting and bite if you were only patient enough to look. There is one discovery, however, that is even more amazing than the bone houses or the moss bandages. Archaeologists have found the skeletons of Ice Age people who had very serious injuries. They found people who had broken their hips, people who had lost their sight, and people who were born with bodies that didn't work quite right. In the world of wild animals, if an animal breaks its leg, it dies. It cannot hunt, it cannot run, and the rest of the pack leaves it behind. But the human skeletons show something different. They show that these people lived for many years. After their injuries, their bones had healed, and they had been fed and kept warm for a long time. This is the most beautiful secret of the sanctuary, the power of kindness. It means that 30,000 years ago, when a hunter was crushed by a mammoth and couldn't walk anymore, the tribe didn't leave him in the snow. They carried him back to the bone palace. They gave him the best meat. They changed his moss bandages every day. They kept him by the fire. This act of looking after the useless members of the tribe is what truly made us human. It showed that we valued a person's life not just for what they could catch, but for who they were. An old woman who couldn't hunt anymore was still valuable because she knew the songs of the map. An injured man was still valuable because he could teach the children how to knap flint. We realized that our strength wasn't just in our muscles, but in our connections to each other. Kindness was a survival strategy. By making sure no one was left behind, the tribe kept its memories and its wisdom alive. The sanctuary was a place of love, and respect, a place where the weak were protected by the strong. This social bond was a shield that was stronger than any stone wall. It allowed us to survive as a group when we would have failed as individuals. The sanctuary was also the place where we celebrated the spirit of the tribe. As the fire burned low in the center of the bone palace, the people would gather to do things that had nothing to do with food or safety. They would make jewelry out of the teeth of foxes and the shells of the sea. They would carve beautiful shapes into pieces of ivory. They would play music on flutes made from the bones of birds. This was the birth of culture. In the safety of the home, they had the time to dream. They would tell stories about where the sun goes at night and why the mammoths roam. They were creating a shared world of the mind. This imaginary world was just as important as the real world. It gave them hope during the long, dark months when the food was low. It gave them a reason to keep fighting against the cold. The sanctuary wasn't just a place for the body, it was a home for the soul. As the generations passed, the sanctuary changed. The bone palaces were replaced by wooden huts, and the moss bandages were replaced by more complex medicines. But the logic of the Ice Age sanctuary stayed the same. It is the same logic we use today. When you come home and close your door, you are feeling the same sense of peace that our ancestors felt when they stepped inside their mammoth skin tents. When you look after a sick friend or a family member, you are using the same kindness brain that was born in the frost 30,000 years ago. We are the children of those people who decided that a broken bone shouldn't be the end of a life. We are the descendants of the builders who looked at a pile of bones and saw a palace. The Ice Age was a harsh teacher. It tried to starve us with the Great Hunger. It tried to freeze us with the Great White Death. It tried to hunt us with the monsters of the night. But we didn't just survive, we flourished. We used our minds to hunt the giants. We used our patience to save the food. We used our creativity to build the tools. And we used our hearts to build the sanctuary. By the time the giant glaciers finally began to melt and the world started to turn green again, we were a new kind of animal. We were the masters of the planet, not because we had the biggest teeth, but because we had the most organized and kindest communities. We had turned the entire world into our sanctuary. The journey of the Ice Age Chronicles teaches us that humans are built for challenges. We are at our best when the world is at its hardest. It shows us that every modern comfort we have today, from our warm beds to our medicines, is a gift passed down from a long line of survivors who never gave up. It shows us that the most important part of being human is the way we look out for one another. The primal winter was the forge that made us who we are. It taught us the value of a fire, the importance of a story, and the miracle of a helping hand. As we finish our journey through the frost, take a moment to look around you. Look at the walls of your home and feel the warmth of the air. Look at the people in your life and think about the bonds you share. We are no longer living in the age of the mammoth, but the lessons of the sanctuary are still the most important things we own. We have learned that we can beat any winter if we have a plan, a tool, and a friend. The Ice Age is a distant memory. But the spark of genius and the power of kindness are still burning bright in every one of us. We are the survivors of the frost, and we are ready for whatever the new day brings. The story of the Ice Age is over, but the story of humanity is just beginning. We have walked through the deep snow and stood on the edge of the night. We have hunted the giants and healed our wounds. We have built our palaces out of the earth and our songs out of the stars. The world is warming and the green grass is returning to the valleys. The mammoths are fading into the past, but we are walking into the future with our heads held high. We are the thinkers, the builders, the healers, and the dreamers. We are the ones who turned the end of the world into a new beginning. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight, imagine the sound of a distant flute playing a melody by a warm fire in a bone palace long ago. Feel the safety of the mammoth skin walls and the softness of the moss floor. Know that you are part of a very old and very brave family that has survived everything the world could throw at it. The journey is long, but you are never walking it alone. The sanctuary is here, the fire is bright, and the morning is coming. The chronicles are finished. The Ice Age has ended, and the human story continues, forever moving forward, forever reaching for the light. Sleep well and dream of the world we have built together.